All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm very glad to be back here in Paris, the city where basically this talk began for me, because a lot of the work I did while working in Paris inspired this talk. But before I get into it, I'm just going to check, how is the energy level? Are we feeling energized? Are we feeling a bit tired? Yeah? I hope you feel inspired from this morning's talk, so this morning and early afternoon talk. So I hope you can keep that energy up a little bit longer. This is a little bit of a serious topic, but don't worry, I'm also going to make some fun. So my talk today is about how to leverage trust to future-proof retention, and we're going to look at this in a broad scope, so not just customers, also the people you work with. But before I get into this, let me actually show you an overview of the topics we'll be discussing, but also give you an introduction from my personal background. So as Fabrice already mentioned, I worked in Paris for Deezer, a small startup called Spideo, and last year for Hotjar, but I started my career in the Netherlands, basically working as a junior PM for an e-commerce startup back in 2010. And in 2012, I decided to make the move to Berlin to work for an entertainment company called Viacom. After which I basically decided, okay, it was great working there. We saw this whole transition from web to mobile. We worked on entertainment products, so there engaging your customers is really important because also our revenues were ad-driven, so more content consumption, better. But I didn't really learn much about mobile product development. That's why I was very keen to come to Paris to work for Deezer. And I worked for the Flow team, so basically I worked on the personalization team that helped create features that engage customers in a more personalized way. While I worked there, I was also inspired by another startup that actually was selling this type of technology, so recommendations, to other businesses. This company is called Spideo, and Spideo kind of headhunted me for a head of product role because they have a B2B business where they sell recommendation APIs to big video streaming platforms. Think of SFR, Canal+, also customers in Brazil and such. And what I did with them, I helped them launch a software as a service platform. Many of you will be familiar with that, where we simplified the enterprise technology and made it available for smaller creative industries. So between these two roles, I realized, like, as powerful as recommendations can be, they can also suck. And more importantly, we use people's data. So how can we do that in a transparent and trustworthy way and also make sure that people have some control over what we're showing to them, which I'll dig into a bit later. Lastly, last year, I worked for a startup called Hotjar, and there I led the engage and retain teams. And what is true for them is true for many companies. Right now, data is great, but it needs to be translated into insights because then it becomes much more powerful. But we want to do this in transparent and trustworthy ways, which brings me also to this specific talk. Today, I actually work as a venture builder, and for me, working with other companies who are launching innovation initiatives, it remains the same, that I need to have trust with my customers, the end users that we're serving, and that's why this talk remains relevant for me. But I've said a lot about trust. And you might ask, okay, but what is trust? And more specifically, do you trust me? Might be hard to answer that question right now, but trust is basically the firm belief in the reliability, truth, ability, or strength of someone or something. Might be a bit hard to tell right now if you feel like you can trust me, so I'm going to help with that. It turns out there are a couple of elements that really help us. Oh, I need to make sure I get to the next slide. Yes. There's a couple of elements that help us assess if someone is trustworthy. So key components that make us understand, is this person reliable? Do I trust them? So there's three of them, as you can see in this trust triangle. I'm referencing here a TED Talk given by Frances Fry. She's a professor at the Harvard Business School, and she worked with the Uber leadership team a couple of years ago when they were going through quite a, let's say, a trust exercise where they really needed to rebuild trust with their internal team, but also towards the external world. And what she realized is that there's three elements that make someone trustworthy, which is first, authenticity. Right now, I'm standing here in front of you. And I'm trying to be my real self. And I hope that you can experience that I'm not trying to be a persona, that I'm trying to be the real me. Second, I hope that after this talk, you feel that there was some logic to the things that I was telling you, that my judgment makes sense, that I'm presenting facts to you that are reliable. And lastly, there's empathy. I hope you understand that I'm here on this stage and worked on those slides and the content of this presentation to help empower you in your jobs and be more successful in retaining customers and building this type of trust relationship with each other. If you're interested actually in reading more of that, there's a book that I'm referencing here. Also, totally look at the TED Talk that you can find on YouTube and such. But let me give you an example of when things don't go so well. Because sometimes we experience a trust wobble. In my case, in one of my last leadership roles, I experienced an empathy wobble. So basically, we were going through quite a big transition. Actually, we were implementing a design system from the previous talk. And in order to implement those design system components, we had to do a tech migration. I'll spare you the details, but we had one specific squad that had a lot of work to do to enable us to accomplish this rebrand and to implement the design system. And we're kind of behind, and we're trying to figure out what was happening there. And I kind of been given this mission: stress the importance of what we're doing, make sure that they're aligned on our mission, and kind of figure out why is stuff not happening. So I went into this meeting, skip level session, and let me say my message didn't land so well. They really felt that I was not understanding the staffing needs that they had. They had addressed that they needed more developers. The PM had recently left. Yes, we were going through a hiring process, but the tech leads, the developers were all like, you're telling us to prioritize something, but you're not empathizing with us, so you don't see our problems, our needs. And they were right. I'd gone into that meeting with, I have a message that I really need to deliver on, but I didn't really empathize with the people that were receiving that message and understanding their needs. So obviously, as a next step, what can you do? Well, the best thing when you make a mistake like that is admit it. Be like, yes, I messed up. I should have been more empathetic. So how can we rebuild that trust? Well, luckily, that is doable. There are easy ways to do it, which is, on the one hand, being open about your mistake, and then figuring out how can I help them out. So hearing, of course, what were their concerns. I involved the tech lead in the recruitment process, and they turned out to be really good at product recruitment. And that team actually became more motivated because we were more involved and more aware of their specific needs. So it turned out to become a good story, but that only worked because we had to realize something went wrong there, and the problem was me. Now, that's all great, speaking about the colleagues you work with and the teams, because we all lead squads, we have teams we work with, so communication is important. But what about customers? Well, there was a research that the Adobe team did last year, their marketing research series, and they asked customers what do they find important in terms of building trust. Turns out there are 3 things customers find really important. First of all, ask permission to use their data. Number 2, actually it's a shared number 2, give them control over how their data is used. And third, or actually on a shared second place, being open and transparent. So I share some examples here, for instance, the new app tracking policies, and also Google announced that they're going to allow you to have a little bit more control over the advertisements that are going to be shown to you, specifically more sensitive categories, because sometimes that's not really helpful and you want to have some control over that. This year, they published another report, and funny thing is that actually 58% of consumers said that they left a brand last year because they violated their trust. If we look specifically at Gen Z, it's 72%, of which 29% left 3 brands or more because of trust violations. So this is why I want to stress this message. This is very important. More interesting, I would say, it's the fact that marketeers themselves thought that control was not that important. They actually ranked it lowest. And they ranked personalization on top. And yes, personalization is a great way to build trust if it works well. Turns out that only 37% of customers actually felt their personalization experiences had improved in the past year. And the other part actually said they stayed the same or gotten worse. A third didn't even care about the value of personalization because they're not seeing it. As someone who's worked in this field of work, I understand. because this is a lot of experiences you can relate to, where people get recommended content and they feel, this is not personalized, this is not me. And yes, there are improvements in the market, and I have to say the entertainment industry is a good example. For instance, I love this specific artist, Taku. So if someone recommends me other music similar to that, I understand the context. You can explain it to me. Other examples are, for instance, being able to give more explicit feedback. If the recommendations aren't completely right, you can tell the algorithm, not for me, or if you love it, not just a like, but you can even give it a double like now. Then there's my old friends at Deezer, who actually updated the Flow experience to now allow people to set it to your mood. Because if you know Flow, Flow is a personalized radio, which is great to get content recommended based on what you've been listening to. But it can be a bit messy at times, especially if you have a broad interest in music. So this is another way of setting it to your specific mood, which is something we uncovered in the user interviews we did a couple of years ago. And lastly, for the startup I worked for, Spideo, we actually created these thematic playlists where we can play around with specific elements of a piece of content that might appeal to someone. So instead of just recommending based on one piece, specific elements within that content, we call that semantic data. It's ways to describe the content, to recommend content. OK, so I've created some shared understanding, I hope. I hope you have a better idea of what I mean by trust, and within the context we're going to speak about this. So we're going to start with level 1, which is about measuring trust. There are different ways to measure trust. Obviously, we have the classic business objectives, like what are our OKRs, what's our North Star. Then there's the market signals, like using the trends, seeing some strategic foresight about the market, like where are we heading towards. And then there's what I call customer experience, user experience, product experience data, which we're going to simplify into product insights, and something that I call hard metrics. I'm not sure if all of you are familiar with this. This is a framework developed by Google's research team, and it was a way to actually measure the customer experience in a larger scale. So understanding how customers are experiencing the product, not specific to, okay, are they engaging on a specific feature, but more things that create a holistic customer experience. So it consists out of the age of happiness, which is measured as a satisfaction metric. This can be a literal happiness score, which we had at Hotjar, but it can also be a net promoter score or any other way to assess how satisfied people are with your product, or CSAT, for instance. Then there's engagement. Well, engagement metrics, I think many of you are familiar with. This depends a little bit on your product, because this presentation is trying to cross between B2C and B2B, so I don't want to fill in everything for you, but it could be page views, it could be session time. There are different ways to look at this. Then there's adoption, that's specific about how many new users do you get onboarded onto your product. Specifically retention, that this talk is about, which is more about building long-term loyalty with customers, which we can measure in certain day activity, like from everyone who signed up on a given day, how many of them are left after a week, a month, a year, depending on how long your product needs to be used for. And then lastly, there's task success, which is more about user accomplishments, which you can do through surveys, like, for instance, how much time does it take for someone to complete a certain task. As I mentioned, the focus will be mostly on retention, but you'll see happiness come by as sort of another way of measuring customer satisfaction, because yes, building trust is also about creating frictionless and good experiences. So how do we track them? Well, I created a fake dashboard here in Amplitude, because I can't show you the one that I created with the Hotjar team. But with the Hotjar team, we actually created one in Mixpanel. And I was helped by 2 of the PMs on my team, Pedro and Sam, because they were more of the Mixpanel experts. So we basically tracked the different metrics through a dashboard that we would then use in weekly meetings. So once a week we would, or once every 2 weeks, we actually had a kind of a product demo where all the teams would present the work that they've been doing, and we would use this dashboard to kind of show, okay, what are the health metrics of the work that we're doing? Is anything affected? Do we see any signals that we need to dig into a little bit more? So you see feature engagement, onboarding. I created this little retention funnel, add to cart, which is more specific to creating a specific task. And of course, for the happiness one, you have this little widget. I'll ask you after the talk how lucky you will be to recommend this, but this is, for instance, a little widget you can use on your website, how satisfied customers are, and it's important to measure this over time, because of course, sometimes you release a product and things are not exactly how you want, so it's interesting to see over time if this metric improves or not. I'll give you one example of how we used retention metrics and trust to retain customers for one of our customers. So this is a B2B story 3 years ago. Many of you might be familiar with Game of Thrones. And if you're not familiar with Game of Thrones, there's probably some other series that you absolutely love, and whatever platform it will be on, you will go there to try and watch it. The problem with video content, and is different from music content, is that there's a lot of differences per platform. It either has to do with acquisitions, it's their own created content. Music streaming services are trying to navigate this also a little bit by having some exclusives, but still, you could say that 80–90% of each music library is the same, whereas with video content, there's quite a lot of difference. So how do you retain customers after a mega season finale? Well, you try to recommend them something new to watch that they hopefully also want to binge on and enjoy and love to stay on your platform with. So what Spideo specializes in, what I told you a little bit before, is actually the descriptive data, like how do you describe the type of content that you're consuming. So we created, instead of just specific for the content, this also for users, but it's non-personally identifiable information. It's simply about your taste. So if you're a Game of Thrones lover, the things that probably resonate with you is suspenseful content, it's sensual content, power plays, heroic fantasy. So there are some elements here that I've highlighted. And based on that, we can basically give you a good recommendation as a Game of Thrones fan of a series that you might like. This is not the only approach we use. We also use some thematic playlists that I introduced earlier. And it did not only increase engagement for this specific campaign, because at least half of the people who clicked on the reel actually ended up consuming the content, but more importantly, it increased the loyalty and the net promoter score, so the happiness score of customers on the platform. Of course, there's a lot more that comes into play. It's not just recommendations who can do it, but if you do it right, you can actually build trust and you can actually give customers a better experience. So now that we've gone through some of the metrics about measuring trust, I think we're nearly ready for the second level. But you might ask, why do we actually need this talk? Well, from my personal point of view, and why I'm feeling inspired to give this talk, is because I feel digital safety needs to be prioritized. We've all seen the headlines of the past few years. They don't look too pretty. It kind of shows that we have some issues in terms of protecting people's privacy and how people are experiencing the web and other technologies. So based on that, we might ask, how do we rebuild trust? Well, the simple answer is transparency, but before I go into that, let me actually go quickly through the customer trust funnel, because I keep kind of hammering on happiness, on retention, as some of the core metrics to measure trust. So basically, it starts how a customer is introduced to your product. Like, do you deliver on the promise that you're giving to them? Do you protect their privacy data? Are the terms and conditions fair? Are they understandable? Is the pricing of your platform actually fair? If I pay for it, am I not surprised afterwards for extra costs that might occur or recurring costs that I'm not made very aware of? Then, of course, the retention itself. What's our happiness score over time? Like, how do people interact with it the longer they are a customer? Do they keep getting value out of our product experience? And then lastly, how often do customers actually share the insights with others? How many new accounts are created? This is more specific to B2B, but you could look at it as family accounts, for instance, in streaming, or the amount of purchases someone would make on an e-commerce platform. So going to that first example, like, for instance, when you access a website for the first time or regularly, we're all familiar with the cookie policies. So the one on the left is from the BBC. As you can see, they have a high-level ranking of strictly necessary cookies, functional cookies. They explain it, but if you want to read more, you can click on a link to see more details. The one on the right is from the Forbes website. I made a little screen recording because I realized it's not that simple to click everything and say no, because I am definitely someone who doesn't want to share my cookies unless I can't access something otherwise. And as you see, it's a whole list that I have to go through, and I started to get worried. Do I really have to click no everywhere? Oh no, wait, there's a reject all button. From my point of view, I find the version on the left a bit more transparent and more trustworthy. The right one is kind of making it harder for me to have the type of experience I want. Second, product pricing. I give a B2C example on the left for the HBO Max website. Stephanie is speaking on the other stage, and what I really like is that, unlike some of the other services, they make it very clear what you pay on a monthly basis. It's very easy to give you the discount when you take a yearly subscription, but no, they decided to be very transparent and be very clear about what you get for an account like that. Okay, might be pretty straightforward because it's B2C, it's streaming, but I might have looked at some competitor websites that were not as transparent about this. On the right, you actually see the new pricing page of Hotjar that was released a couple of weeks ago. You can select quickly if you want to pay yearly or monthly. And then you get a whole overview where you can play around with the amount of sessions. But they also have a free for all and free for forever plan that they highlight, but they make sure that you see what you actually get, which is very limited, to be very fair. But at least it's like displayed in a transparent way. Then there's something I call radical transparency. Radical transparency is taking it a step further. I'm giving you a few examples here of companies who work in the retail and fashion space who decided, instead of being just transparent in an understandable way, which we kind of covered up until now, let's actually share, if you're going to buy this pair of jeans from Reformation, how much you're going to save in comparison to other brands in terms of like the amount of carbon emissions, for instance, and water savings. Then there's Everlane, who are using a similar thing in terms of the production cost of a piece of fabric or a piece of, I think this is a jacket, where they say the true cost, what they're charging, and traditional retail. You might also think, oh, that's pretty good marketing. Yes, of course. Like, they're being very transparent, they're being very open, but are they that open? They're also using this, of course, as an opportunity to sell. There's another company called Provenance. They're quite known in the UK, and they actually help with a similar traceability within supermarkets. So, for instance, if you're buying a fish, you can actually trace where it was caught and the journey it took to get to your supermarket. They work together with a company called A Transparent Company, who do the same thing with fashion. So you have basically like a QR code that you can scan, and through, I think they use blockchain technology, you can actually see the different steps it went through to arrive in the shop and for you to wear. Then there's a couple of companies who are known to be more emission-driven. You might all be aware of Patagonia. If not, they are known to basically tell people, do not buy our product. That sounds a bit funny because you're like, well, people need outdoor clothes. Of course, you know, you're making these products, you want to sell them. But they're trying to encourage people to have their clothes remade, buy them secondhand, and not buy too many. Like, do we need all that? There's a company called Tony Chocolonely's from the Netherlands. I think you might be able to get it in France now as well. They make great chocolate, and their bigger mission is to try and eradicate child labor from their supply chain. It's very complicated. Even them have not been able to do it to full success, but at least they've made it super transparent, so they know a certain percentage of their supply chain where there's still child labor involved, and they're actively working to eradicate it. But the funny thing is, they also did a campaign to say, I'm bad for your health. I mean, we all love chocolate, but indeed, it's not great for your health. They actually are trying to convince the Dutch government to apply a sugar tax, because today you pay the same amount of tax over chocolate as you do over vegetables, which is maybe a bit strange. And lastly, I'm giving an example here of Lego about everyone is awesome, which is a great set that they created because, unfortunately, toys can enforce gender stereotypes, and this is a more inclusive set to really celebrate everyone is awesome and everyone is welcome. I've now spoken a lot about customer experiences, but I want to go back to our experience. Many of us have been in recruitment processes over the past years. Some of us might be recruiting for talent. There's a new law coming into effect in August. Obviously, it's a European law, so companies have about 2 years to implement it. But what it boils down to is providing transparency about gender pay gaps, where women still get paid less than men. Luckily, not everywhere, but you have to be open about this. More importantly, companies have to actually share the salary range. So there can't be any hiding anymore. You start interviewing, and at the end, they're trying to hire you for a different salary. It makes the playing field, I think, a lot more fair for everyone. And it might also create a little bit more stability, because we've seen some crazy differences in salaries and a lot of fluctuation. So just know that this law is coming, and it's another way of actually putting transparency into effect, this time actually through government rules, or in this case, EU law. But again, speaking about first movers, there's a few companies who push this a step further. One of them is Buffer. Buffer displays the salaries of all their employees on their website, and they also display the money that they're making, and they're also displaying the diversity at Buffer. So they're being fully transparent. If you go and work for us, these are things we find important. We don't want to hide how much we're earning. We don't want to hide how much the people in your teams are making. They actually have a calculator where you can see, based on your location, what you will be earning if you join them, because yes, they do create a discrepancy between, for instance, working from New York or working from Barcelona. But I also like the fact that they're calling themselves out on things that they could still improve on. In the end, it's all about creating equal opportunities for everyone. So lastly, and this is to wrap it up, I also want to give you some tools to kind of start applying this in your own work. So there's this little thing called the transparency test that I came across from Daniel Schreiber, co-founder of an insurance company in the US. And basically, it's 2 questions that you can ask yourself, or even your stakeholders at check-ins. Are we withholding information to maximize understanding? Think of, for instance, the cookie policies from the BBC. Do I need to know everything? Would more information for this audience at this time on this medium aid or hinder their understanding? Sometimes when you're bombarded with lots of information, I would say the Forbes website with all the things, it doesn't really help me understand better. And other times, I might want to know, if I sign a contract for a mortgage, for an insurance, I might want to look into the finer details. But do I have to see them on my first screen? Can I get them sent to myself? Because sometimes the device also matters. If you're going through a mobile sign-up flow, you have a different experience normally than on web. So this is also where sometimes certain steps of the sign-up processes we can delay, or actually give users the opportunity to read about something later before agreeing to it. So we've reached level 2. We actually took the transparency test. We know now a bit more about how to build trust. I'm going to switch to a topic that I'm not sure if you're all familiar with, which is ethical decision-making. What is this? Well, it comes down to understanding that we, as product managers, product designers, researchers, developers, have a social responsibility. We're developing products for people, human beings, people like ourselves, our families, our friends, but also people we don't know. So it's important to understand, how can my product negatively impact society? This sounds a bit like, okay, but maybe you're working on a fun thing, like a gaming app, like how could this negatively impact society? Well, maybe it's about the time people are spending on the device, like is the engagement still done in a meaningful way? Do people have some control over this? Just as an example. Because whatever we're building, if you build a plane, you inevitably build the plane crash. A very good example is from one of the organizers here, Fabri de Mazri, who just actually welcomed me on stage. Because one of his first startups, he ended up selling to NASA, because it was a neurotech startup, and he was afraid people would misuse the technology if he would sell it to a different type of company. Now, we might not all be in that type of position where whatever we're building could actually be misused, or people would actually hunt us down or try and steal our information to potentially harm humanity. But still, I think for all of us, it's important to remember that sometimes when we're building products, there are unintended consequences. Think about the developer who thought the like button was a good idea because everybody kept saying, like, great. It had some other unintended consequences afterwards that he could not have foreseen. A good way to start to really be more aware of the ethical decision makings we do is to establish ethical product principles. Some of you might already be aware or are using product principles. So for the heads of product who maybe set these principles, I want to ask you to start thinking about how to apply these in an ethical way, so to establish some core ethics criteria. Secondly, it's also good to identify the shortcomings of your product and the market today. Because even if you're launching a new product, maybe you already know that the market today has some shortcomings. That could be potential bias, it can be related to data privacy, but also underserved audiences. Like, do we actually build for accessibility? Is our product available for people from different backgrounds? And then thirdly, bake ethics into the product development process. So start with discovery all the way to delivery. So when we're developing products, it could be as simple as when you do a design sprint, create a how might we ensure that our product is built for inclusivity. It can be when we actually launch a product in the wild, seeing how does it actually react, how do people use it. I also think a good way, and I know actually I remember going to a talk a couple of years ago from BlaBlaCar, where they actually explained how they dog fooded their own product. And actually discovered some pain points that they might not have been aware of if they didn't do this beforehand. And I'm highlighting specifically the inclusivity part, so working with underserved audiences, which Jutta Treviranus, she's a professor at the University of Toronto and a really big driver of inclusivity principles for the web, says it's like designing for the edges. And this little how do I call it? This starburst here on the left, it kind of displays the Pareto principle. So you have this dense cluster of 80% that's taking up 20% of the space, and we're used to, from a business mindset, to focus on the 80-20 rule. So basically, with 20% of our resources, we develop something that works for 80%. But that does mean that there are users who have problem using our product. And there's even an outer range that can't really use our design. So what she's trying to do, and what I actually want us all to be more aware of, is that it could be really good to develop for those outer edges. Because today you might not be aware of that, but you'll soon discover either you or someone around you will have more problems using the products that you're building today. So we've reached establishing ethical product principles. Last thing I want to say, because I think some of you might be like, okay, great, product principles, but I am just, I'm a product manager, what can I do today with my team? Well, I want to encourage you to speak about ethics, so discuss the unhappy customer journey for a change. Are we going to make trade-offs that could harm a portion of users? And what's the worst that can happen if our product is misused? One example here that I give is actually from crash dummies that were built for average white men and do not take into account people with a different shape. What might help with this is actually creating a risk checklist. I don't know if some of you are familiar with some of the security protocols. If you work with security protocols, you anyway need to have checklists. But these checklists are based on what surgeons do as well before an operation. Like the error rate of them making mistakes is a lot lower when they use these checklists. So I want to encourage you to do the same. So already start in the discovery process to highlight, are we going to use any personal identifiable data? Is our product transparent, or might we have some issues? Data integrity, accessibility, and potentially unforeseen consequences, which could even be covered just speaking with your legal team and reviewing your terms and conditions and deciding if there's a strategy to be taken. So this is level 4. It's the final one. We've reduced risk through checklist, hopefully. So to see if you kind of paid attention, got the gist of it, I'm going to try a few statements with you. So I'm going to bring back the personal identifiable information, transparency, data integrity is also bias, accessibility, and potentially unforeseen consequences. So let's try the first. I'm going to ask you if this works. Yes. I don't know if you encountered one of those, but I did last year. A product that measures your body temperature before you enter a building. Very typical COVID product. Who of you think that there could be a risk with personal identifiable information with this type of product? Who of you think there could be issues with transparency? Data integrity? Yeah. Accessibility? Unforeseen consequences? Very good. I think there's not a right or wrong answer in this case. There are a lot of things that we can already imagine just in this crowd, what could go wrong. One of these machines was just measuring my body temperature, but you know, if your body temperature does not fit the classics, you might already have some issues. There was another one that actually also measured, or actually had a camera in there. What happens with my face? What happens with my personal information? So there are a lot of things that we can already imagine that might go wrong here. Last one, maybe some of you are familiar with this as well, an HR tool that allows you to rate your colleagues' performance and vice versa. PII issues? Anyone? Transparency? Yep. Data integrity? Accessibility? Maybe a little less, but yes, also unforeseen consequences. Yeah, I think, again, in this room, we can imagine, or we might have experienced some of these cases where it didn't really work out as planned. So this is just to leave you with the end of this day with a few highlights here of the different levels and measures you can apply to build more trust with your team and the customers who you're building products for. That was it, so thank you so much. Yes.
So thank you a lot, especially for the advertising for my book. I didn't pay her to do that, okay? All right, let's be honest. So we have several questions. One is, can we use the HEART framework to measure trust for an organization, so for people, not for products?
That's actually a very good question. I remember at Hotjar specifically that the operations team also had specific OKRs to indeed measure employee happiness, for instance, and employee churn. So yes, you can definitely apply it also on an operations team on the HR side. Those are just two very simple examples I give, but I could think in a broader sense as an organization, you could definitely apply the HEART metrics as well. Yeah.
Very clear. Is the business model of ads and addiction to more screen time are able to rebuild trust? Is it possible?
I think it is. I think we've even seen this with, for instance, a product like Instagram, where you can set the maximum amount of time you want to spend in there, and you get this little annoying notification. You've already been spending 15 minutes of your time today. But that's just one example. I also know that, for instance, with YouTube, and I think even Instagram and Facebook as well, you can give feedback to certain ads if you feel they're not appropriate, which happens sometimes. Like, for instance, if you're trying to lose weight and you get weight loss ads, like, don't even do that. So these are the type of things where you can do this. So it's more about giving more control back to customers and actually showcasing that you've added these functionalities because you hear them, you listen to them, and you want to do better.
There's a guy called Ben Callahan who said, how do you balance transparency with education, knowing that information without understanding often creates problems? Very
good question. I've kind of ran through this presentation kind of fast. It's a lot of information to take in. So starting with trust and creating this shared understanding, what I would do with a team, specifically if you're going into your next sprint or so, is do a little workshop around trust. I'm not sure if you've heard of hopes and fears, but that's just one way to do, for instance, a workshop to kind of gather, okay, what are we hoping to do in terms of trust as a team and what we're building with our building for our customers. And making sure we have these conversations between us and also realize like that we have, you know, maybe some different points of view, because that's the whole thing. Different perspectives make us build better and more trustworthy products. So I think it starts with indeed making sure that you do some workshops with your organization and specifically with your team to at least make sure you speak the same language. And the best organizations indeed spend time on value building together. Like I remember last year at Hotjar, we went through an exercise with the whole company. We had like a dedicated team who worked on the values, but then we also, everybody could interact with them. We also needed to have specific examples. So these ethical product principles are great. You want to kind of showcase an example, like, so what is a good example of building with more transparency? Because it sounds a bit vague. For instance, showing our pricing model in a certain way, or letting customers know when we're not collecting any information yet and what's the reason behind it. So that type of conversation, I think, needs to happen not just from a leadership point of view, but you can even start with your own squad or team to have these conversations. Because yes, we need to have a similar understanding of what we're talking about.
Have you found any way to balance between investing into edge users' needs and business-led objectives?
Good question. Yes and no, to be very honest. There are certain initiatives we've taken to make products more accessible. I remember at Deezer, when we were working on the Flow experience, that I was actually the one who didn't think of accessibility at that point. It was one of my iOS developers, Dorothee, who came to me and was like, did we actually think how this copy works on the screen reader, and if the new experience, because we created all these fancy new mobile experiences, if this works? I was like, haven't really thought of that. Could we create a ticket and actually dig into that? So, like, this is why it's really important to speak about it. So yes, we have made some choices there, but I think more importantly, if you decide not to, that is a conscious decision. It's the same thing with security problems. You might want to mitigate the majority of risk. You might want to work with external ethical hackers who actually see if your product is safe or what issues you might have. There's these OWASP checklists. There's a lot of information. But you might also agree, if a risk is small, that you're going to take it. And this is where it actually helps if the data that you're using is not personally identifiable, for instance. If we think more about segments, we think less about genders, age, and classic measures of demographics and such, we can already mitigate that.
Okay, the last question is actually a mix-up of two. How do you convince your CEO to invest into building inclusive products? And if you don't, can values be enforced bottom-up without leadership support?
Wow, that's a very good question. Okay, starting with convincing the CEO. It obviously helps if you have regular conversations with your CEO. If not, I would find a sponsor who can help you deliver this message together. But what helps are data sources. So for instance, I shared this Adobe report with you. I can tell you from the Harvard Business Review to this Adobe report, but there's an Accenture report. Like everywhere, it screams, customers want you to be more aware of how their data is being used. They want you to be more transparent. They want more control. So the numbers don't lie. And the numbers also don't lie when it comes to building retention and actually increasing the happiness score. So what you could try is do like we do with experimentation. Like, give us the opportunity to put a product on the market or a new functionality where we test out some of these functionalities, see how customers respond, see how this drives our metrics. And then over time, it's easier to obviously convince, but I think it starts with sharing the information, back to the education part, shared understanding, making sure we have the right evidence to support this type of decision, and also knowing this is a type of market where you can still be a first mover. I gave you a few examples from certain industries. I'm sure within your industry, there are things that you can do that your competitor does not. And then to kind of reference April's talk, this might be a way of actually having a positioning and a strategy in terms of your sales pitch where you might be able to convince more customers because you're doing it in a more trustworthy way.
Thank you a lot, Elize, for your talk.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.